Hi, I'm Megan Lazovick. I'm thrilled to be here at Podcast Movement Evolutions in a space filled with people dedicated to the growth of audio, which is why the study I will be presenting today fits so perfectly on the agenda. The Infinite Dial has documented changing audio and technology behaviors in the US since before the turn of the century. And for those of you watching the stream online, hello, thanks for being here today. You are part of the legacy of Infinite Dial, a report created for those curious about emerging technologies and the infinite options available to consumers. It is the longest running survey of digital media consumer behavior in America. How many of you have used data from the Infinite Dial in your sales pitches while weighing business decisions or even explaining your career choices to your family members? Yes, I see a few hands there. This study provides the details you need to tell a story about the audio space today. And we have to thank our generous supporters, Odyssey, Cumulus Media, and SiriusXM Media, for making this year's report possible. To everyone at these organizations, we are all so appreciative of how you help bring this vital information to many people who use it. Now, perhaps some of you are still reeling from the change to the Apple operating system that led to reduced download numbers. And while it's hard to rationalize when you see those numbers drop so drastically, you certainly know that reduced numbers doesn't necessarily mean reduced listens. This year's Infinite Dial will give you the definitive answer you need to prove that podcast listening, despite some misconceptions, is not dropping. In fact, we're happy to report this. Podcast listening has increased since last year's Infinite Dial report, and it has increased in every measure. Overall listening, monthly listening, and weekly listening. So stick around for the newly released numbers today. I promise you'll leave happy. Of course, the Infinite Dial provides a number of other benchmarking data points important to those looking to understand consumer behavior. In addition to podcast data, we have the latest ownership estimates on several devices, online audio usage overall and by brand, and social media awareness and usage. Now, it's important for you to know how rigorous we are with this study. In January 2024, Edison Research conducted a survey of over 1,000 individuals aged 12 and older. Now, to represent the US population as precisely as possible, we offer the survey both in English and Spanish. We use random digit dialing techniques to reach cell phones and landlines, and we supplemented with an online probability panel to increase coverage among teenagers. We also weight the data to the national US population figures, so we're taking all of the appropriate steps to create estimates that fully represent the US population. Now, the Infinite Dial has measured a lot of new tech over the years, from the number of households with personal computers, to the usage of email, to the growing access of broadband internet. And when technology got smart, we started to observe a big swing in consumer behavior. By smart, I mean smart devices, smartphones, smart TVs, smart speakers. These devices with digital connectivity designed to make access to content easier than ever are fully integrated in consumers' lives. 93% of the US population aged 12 and older own a smart device, such as a smartphone, smart TV, or smart speaker. I see a couple of you taking photos. Don't worry, this is going to be on our website after this presentation today. Same for you at home watching the stream. We'll have it on edisonresearch.com. So 5 years ago, that percentage was 85%. So we went from 85 5 years ago to 93% owning one of these smart devices. Now, here's a chart documenting the percent of Americans who own a smartphone. When we first asked about smartphone ownership in 2009, only 10% of the US population had one. Then we see the percentage shot up over time, sitting at 90% of the US population aged 12 and older today. This is especially a hot topic in my household, as my almost 12-year-old insists that all of her friends have phones, and please, 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 can she have one? And yes, I told her I was writing her into this script. Now, I've been hesitating because I know the undeniable truth. Smartphones, these smart devices, change habits. Here's another piece of technology that has led to changes in media usage. Smart TV has made it easy for consumers to access the ever-growing list of streaming content. When we measured it in 2021, 61% of Americans owned a smart TV, and that has grown consistently every year. In 2024, 74% of Americans own such a device, hitting the impressive estimate of 207 million Americans. Now, smart speakers, or speakers using voice assistants such as Alexa, Google Assistant, Siri, and others, were adopted quickly in homes after they came onto the market. Back in 2017, 7% of the US population owned a smart speaker. By 2021, a third of the population owned one. And we saw a peak ownership at 36% in 2023, but our estimates are at 34% this year. So we're detecting a cooling in excitement around these devices, but they're still in more than a third of these households. And while that excitement is dwindling, the number here could reflect the evolution of smart technology, having the voice assistant in all types of products. Still, these devices are fantastic for allowing easy access to audio content throughout the home. 21% of the US population, age 12 and older, have listened to audio on a smart speaker in the last month. And 17% said they use a smart speaker to listen to audio in the last week. So, for about 1 in 6 Americans, the smart speaker is a device being used regularly for audio. And we can say that many of those who have adopted a smart speaker in the home find reasons to purchase more than one. And the number of devices in these homes is increasing. In 2018, 70% of smart speaker owners only owned one device. But quickly, owning more than one device became the norm for most of smart speaker owners. By 2019, the smart speaker household owned an average of 2 devices. It ticked up consistently until 2024, where 36% of smart speaker owners have only one device, 21% have 2, and 43% have 3 or more devices. I'll bring up the averages here on the side. As you can see in the bottom of this graph, the average home with any smart speaker now has about 3 of them. Now, while some may describe the smart speaker as a replacement for analog radio, let's compare that to radio in homes today. 34% of Americans have a smart speaker in their home versus 60% with a radio in their home. An estimated 172 million Americans have radios in homes. There is just about a quarter of the population that said they don't own either, presumably using one of the other devices we talked about, those smart devices. Now, let's talk about radio's role outside of the home. We asked the 85% of adults in our study who have driven in a vehicle in the last week, which of the following sources they use in the car. Here's a list of all the items they use. Topping the list, probably not a surprise, AM/FM radio. 70% said they use a radio in a vehicle. For most Americans, in most vehicles, AM/FM radio is the most accessible, with years of habitual listening. Keep in mind that this list is not mutually exclusive. A respondent can say they use multiple sources, and as you can see, they do. That's why we see that the majority of drivers also listen to online radio. 55% use online radio in the car, or online audio in the car. That can be any number of digital audio sources streamed over the internet, either via a phone or directly through the vehicle system. Podcast listening ranks number 3 in the car. That's 32% choosing to listen to podcasts on the road. Some of you are probably surprised to see that 25% report using CDs. Certainly, if we cut this data by the age of vehicle, the percentage would be much lower among newer vehicles. But this 25% reminds us how people hang on to their vehicles for a long time. Sirius XM comes in at 22%. This number as well may look different if you cut the data by age of vehicle, as it comes standard with most new vehicle purchases. At the bottom of the list, we see digital files, and new this year, we asked about using popular phone interfaces. We can report that 16% of American drivers now say they use Apple CarPlay in their cars, and Android Auto is being used by 10%. These will be very interesting to track moving forward in future studies. As I said, the car stock in the US turns over slowly, with only about 5% of cars on the road in any given year being from the newest model year. Now, one of the platforms that have benefited from Americans, or at least their technology, getting smarter is, of course, podcasting. We've documented growth in the podcast space almost every single year we've measured it. And this year is not the exception. Podcast listening is up. So let's pull up the historic podcasting data, that benchmarking data the industry has cited every year, and reveal the new figures you'll be using. In 2006, we added the question, are you familiar with the term podcasting, into our infinite dial study. Back in the classic iPod days, 22% of Americans had heard of podcasts. Today, almost everyone and their mom has heard about podcasts. This is a beautiful sweeping line. About 5 years ago, familiarity had doubled. It followed with a few years of slow but steady growth. Then it picked up rapidly in the late teens. Today, 84%, or 241 million Americans, are familiar with a podcast. Now, we've basically documented the same pattern with podcast listening. Relatively slow growth at first, and then much more generous growth over the last number of years. This year, 67% of Americans have ever listened to a podcast. That's up by 3 points since 2023. That's an incredible 192 million Americans who have now listened to a podcast. And as you can see on this graph, our estimates for having listened to a podcast in the last month have grown consistently as well, with the exception of the last 2 years. We field these studies right at the beginning of each year, and you can see our 2021 estimate, the one most affected by COVID, probably got a little ahead of schedule. That led to pullback in 2022, followed by a nice recovery pattern last year at 42%. Now, let's look at the estimate for 2024. I'm going to make you wait, especially because James has his camera up. Okay, here's the number, 47%, one of the biggest year-over-year increases we have recorded, and probably back on the track podcasting was on before COVID disrupted the pattern. Think about this. Nearly half of all Americans tell us they have listened to a podcast in the last month. Let's look at the monthly listeners by gender. On this left, we show the percent of men who have listened to a podcast in the last month by each report starting since 2021. And on the right, we have trending for women. Male monthly podcast listeners has reached a new high at 48%, a 2-point gain over estimates in 2023. And only another 2 points away from that majority point. Women listeners also reached a new high at 45%. They've gained 6 points from 2023, which is a 15% increase in women listeners. The gap that used to exist between male monthly podcast listeners and female monthly podcast listeners is nearly eliminated. This is a big part of the story for podcasts in 2024. The growth in podcast reach is driven by large increases among the number of female listeners. While many top shows are successful because they appeal to all genders, there are all types of shows appealing to the specific needs of women. And these are the shows that are going to see a huge lift as women close the listening gap. Last year, Edison and SXM Media released the Women Podcast Report. It is a fantastic resource for information about this audience, so check it out if you haven't already seen it. Here's monthly podcast listening by age. As you can see, we are reporting growth across all age groups. In 2021, well over a majority, or 56% of those 12 to 34 were monthly podcast listeners. In 2022, after COVID dipped a bit, with percentages dropping just to 50%. But then monthly listening mostly bounced back among this age to 55%. Well, today it's up another 4 points to 59%. The bigger story here is with the middle generation, those aged 35 to 54. This group is now well past the halfway point, with 55% of this age group reporting monthly listening. This group is consistently gaining year over year. Finally, we're seeing gains among this older age group, age 55 and older. Listening for this group was at 26% back in 2021, then it dipped below in the following 2 years, and it jumped 6 points since 2023, is now at 27% of those 55 and older are monthly podcast listeners. Last year, Edison president Larry Rosen presented Hit Play Boomer, a report detailing the opportunity with podcasts among this generation. It's worth checking out if you haven't already seen it, and boomers are worth your time and attention as they index high as spoken word listeners and increasingly open to it in its digital forms. Let's move on to weekly figures. This might be the most exciting slide for you podcasters out there. Yes, it's great to see that monthly listening has increased. You're reaching a lot of people through your regular podcasts, but that weekly audience, your core audience, the listeners looking forward to your next episode, the people who turn into your most loyal listeners, those numbers are increasing as well. 34% of the US 12 plus population said they've listened to a podcast in the past week. That's up from 31% in 2023. Just over a third of Americans now listen to podcasts weekly. And we estimate that equal 98 million weekly podcast listeners in the US. So take this headline home with you and think about what it means to have access to so many people every week. It's a pretty great story to tell. Yes, you can take your pictures now. The US podcast audience nears 100 million weekly listeners. We asked those weekly listeners how many podcasts they listen to in a typical week. The responses varied from those who answered only one episode to double digits. But in a typical week, weekly podcast listeners reported listening to an average of 8.3 episodes. What's fascinating, however, is when we look at the average by gender. The average number of episodes among male weekly podcast listeners is less than that at 7.2, and women tended to listen to more. They average 9.5 episodes in a typical week. Some of you may be familiar with Edison Podcast Metrics, an ongoing study from Edison that details the listening among this group of podcast listeners, this weekly group. It is the only podcast measurement service that measures listening, not downloads, across all networks, shows, and platforms. So be sure to subscribe to our newsletter, our free newsletter, for the latest rankers about this weekly audience on edisonresearch.com. Let's look at the big picture here. We looked at podcast listening many ways, and here's the overview. 16% of the US population not aware of podcasts. 17% are aware but have not listened. Combine those two parts, and that's a third of the US population that we can call our potential podcast listeners. Then you have the 20% who have listened, just not in the past month, and 13% who listened in the past month, not in the past week. Combine those two groups together, that's another third of the US population with potential to move further down the podcast funnel, some of who will eventually become this final group. Those ride or die people who have listened to a podcast in the last week. Right now, they account for the remaining third of the US population, and surely there is an opportunity to find more of them. Now, there's good news for those of you in the world of audio. In addition to podcasting, streaming audio hits record highs this year. While the original intent of this research series back in 1998 was to measure habits in the age of the newly emerging internet radio, the study evolved into measuring all types of online audio. In this next section, we look at over 2 decades worth of tracking. Now, when we refer to online audio in this section, I mean any listening to streams of AM/FM radio or listening to audio content available only on the internet. As you can see in this image, over the span of this research series, many players in the space of online audio have come and gone. Yet overall listening continues to increase among the US population. Here's the percentage of people who say they listened to online audio in the last month. Starting at 5% at the turn of the century, 10 years later, monthly online audio listening was a quarter of the population. 5 years after that, in 2015, it crossed that halfway point at 53%. And when 53% of Americans were monthly podcast audio listeners. Online audio consumption has continued to steadily rise until last year the category reached another milestone. 75%, 3/4 of the US population, reported listening to online audio in the last month. And then finally this year, it ticked up another point to 76%. That's an estimated 218 million listeners. Here's monthly listening to online audio broken down by age. The younger age group on the left side of this page have been listening to online audio for most of their lives. 90% of this group have listened to online audio in the last month. Those ages 35 to 54 are not too far behind this younger group. In 2022, 81% of this group were monthly online audio listeners, and in 2023, it rose to 85%, and it holds there for 2024. There isn't much movement in terms of listening for those age 55 and older, and this group is pulling the average down a bit. 52% listened to online audio in the past month. Still, that's over half of those age 55 and older using online audio sources. Now, here are the weekly numbers for online audio listening. 70% of the US population aged 12 and older are weekly online audio listeners. While there are no measurable gains in weekly online listening in the past year, I'll remind you that this is only 5 points behind the monthly online listening number at 75%. So when we reviewed the podcast numbers earlier, I spoke about the potential to close the gap between monthly and weekly listeners. Online audio, which has been around for much longer than the podcast machine, has matured and done a great job of closing that gap between monthly and weekly listening. And speaking of mature, Pandora, the OG of online audio, tops the list in online audio brand awareness at 84%. We asked our respondents if they are familiar with the brands you see here on the slide. And after Pandora, the most recognized brand is Spotify at 81%. Apple Music ranks third at 76%, followed by iHeart and YouTube Music at 74%. 71% are familiar with Amazon Music. SoundCloud, not quite familiar to a majority of Americans, with 42% recognizing the brand. Then there's NPR One, which was recently folded into the NPR app. Odyssey and TuneIn follow in the low 20s and teens. Here's that list again, this time showing those who listened in the last week. Spotify is now at the top at 29%. YouTube Music is a strong second at 22%, and Apple Music comes in again at 13%. Pandora and Amazon Music tie at 11%, with iHeart and SoundCloud in single digits. We asked those who currently listen to an online audio brand to tell us which one brand they use most often. And when you look at the total, that top horizontal bar, you see that the most often rank is similar to the weekly listening rank, with Spotify and YouTube on top. But it varies when we look at it by age. Spotify is way out ahead among those 12 to 34 as the preferred brand of 55% of listeners. YouTube Music underperforms with this group at 14% compared to the older groups. Spotify is also a number one among those aged 35 to 54. However, it's a tighter race, with Spotify at 24%, YouTube at 23%, and Apple Music at 16%. And notice how that bottom bar, representing those 55 and older, seem to be a bit more evenly distributed between each brand. YouTube Music gets the nod for the service used most at 22%, followed by Pandora at 19%. You'll notice the red bar for iHeart is the largest here. 12% of those aged 55 and older prefer the iHeart radio service. There's one more form of audio that has seen growth as consumers shift digital. audiobook listening, which of course is still available in analog forms. And that is increasing. We have asked, have you listened to an audiobook in the last year? And we see a record high. 38% of the sample reported this behavior, up 3 points from 2023. That's an estimated 109 million Americans listening to an audiobook in the last year. And I must admit, one of my favorite corners of the internet is what they call book talk. And book talk is for sure driving interest in literature, printed or recorded. And speaking of book talk, social media usage is another area that Infinite Dial has documented over the years. But why survey usage instead of looking at user data? Let's call it an independent audit of the changing interest of users on this site, because what the figureheads would like you to think about usage does not necessarily match up to reality. And I'll reveal that in just a few slides. The next slides aim to help you make decisions important to supporting your business and around where to spend your time and your resources. And it's important for you to stay up to date because it has been a year of change with social media. Here's the percentage of Americans using any social media. In 2008, it was only 10% of the US population. At that time, we were really only covering Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn with the study. In 2021, we first reported, here we go. Let's see, year of change. Yeah, sorry guys. In 2021, we first reported the majority of the 12-plus population used social media, and that surpassed 3/4 in 2015, then rose a bit more and leveled out in the 80s for the past 4 years. Now, each year we ask our study respondents if they are aware of the number of social media brands. The meta brand Facebook, not surprisingly, has the highest awareness among the US population at 94%. And Instagram, also a meta brand, is not far behind at 92%. But TikTok, which was a newcomer just a few years ago, is just a point below Instagram in awareness at 91%. Now let's look at the bottom of the pack. Discord comes in at 43% awareness. Threads, a relatively newcomer from Meta, shows up at 29% awareness, followed by Truth Social, with just 1/4 of the population aware of that, and Mastodon at 7% awareness. Let's plot social media usage over time. Now, the Infinite Dial has tracked usage of many brands, starting with MySpace in 2007. Back then, the usage among the US population was under 20%. I'll add other services to this chart, but keep in mind, it would be unreadable if we tracked all of the social media companies that have come and gone in this time. And many of the brands debuted before we started tracking them on Infinite Dial. We researchers are often very precious when it comes to dedicating questionnaire space. But in 2008, we decided we probably should ask about Facebook, which is, as you can see, it rocketed in usage very quickly. We also asked about LinkedIn that year, which was more slow and steady gains. Now, Twitter, that's a fun story, gaining momentum in the 2010s. In 2023, it was bought by Elon, and months later, it became X. When we measured Instagram, Pinterest, and Snapchat in 2003, Instagram, you can see here, it rose quickly thanks to part of its parent company. And the other two brands here, they have sort of similar growth stories. Let's take a moment to acknowledge the end of MySpace in 2014, and also short-lived Vine, RIP. Then a few years later, we started tracking TikTok, which was formerly Musical.ly. And we watched rapid growth with TikTok. This slide really helps put in perspective, though, the consistent lead that Facebook has had, even after all of these other brands have had time to mature. Here's a closer look at reach percentage among social media brands in 2024. 63% of those age 12 and older in the US use Facebook, followed by Instagram at 44%. TikTok is third at 35%. Pinterest, LinkedIn, and Snapchat, they're in the high 20s. And X, formerly known as Twitter, came in at 19%, with Discord following just 1 point behind at 18%. Threads, pulling users or hoping to pull users from Twitter, didn't actually pull quite enough and sits at 3%. And if you've heard that Truth Social is pulling in big numbers of users, then that's simply not the truth. 2% of those in the US use the site. Mastodon, another hopeful Twitter competitor, comes in only at 1%. Let's dig into that Twitter story a bit more. Here's the trending since we first tracked it in 2010. Then it came in at 7%. By 2022, 27% of the US population used Twitter. That number held in the 2023 study as well. Then, not long after we fielded the study in 2023, it was purchased by Elon. And let's look at the past 2 years a little more closely. In 2023, Infinite Dial estimates placed Twitter with 77 million users. When we fielded the study 1 year later, we now estimate that user base at 55 million. The change from 27% to 19% represents a 30% drop in users, or about 22 million people lost. And here's data for each of these social brands for the past 3 years. And you can see usage is fairly consistent, apart from the growth of LinkedIn and the shrinking of Twitter. Certainly, people can use more than one social media brand. So which one do you use most often? Here's the preferred brands from the past 3 years of this study. You can see the top bar, the 2022 data, that Facebook was the most used service by the majority of Americans. But they have lost ground since then, with the gains mostly going to Instagram and TikTok. Now let's look at the same question by age. The top bar here has the 2024 data among 12-plus population. Then below we have it broken out by the 3 age groups. Among 12 to 34-year-olds, Instagram is the most preferred at 31%. TikTok is second preference at 23%, beating out Facebook by a few points. And while Snapchat is not too competitive among the other age groups, it does well among the younger generation at 12%. If you're specifically interested in reaching younger audiences, look up the Gen Z podcast listener report from Edison Research and SXM Media. These social brands were very important to podcast discovery among this generation. Let's look at the 35 to 50-year-olds. Facebook is used most often by over half of this group at 55%. Instagram at 17%, 9% use TikTok most often. Finally, among the 55 and older crowd, almost 3/4 say they use Facebook most. That leaves very small numbers split among the other services. Listen, I know this was a barrage of information. A lot of data was thrown at you. But if you take away anything, I hope it's the excitement about having all new data free and available to use, because this report was designed to help you understand many aspects of consumer habits. Please go find it on edisonresearch.com. Pull out the figures that are relevant to you and give it the time and attention it deserves. And until you have a chance to do that, here are a few other key observations to remember. Don't confuse download counts for listening. Podcast listening grew strongly in the last year. Listening grew fastest among women, nearly eliminating the gap in listening versus men. And this platform is so much more than chat shows for guys. Just under 100 million Americans age 12 and older now listen to podcasts every week. A milestone that the podcast industry should promote aggressively. Promote this figure. More than 2/3 of Americans age 12 and older use streaming audio each week. Online streams of radio and pure plays is now fully mainstream. Audiobooks see a new high, and Twitter, or X, trails off dramatically. Facebook remains the overwhelming leader, but among younger Americans, it's Instagram and TikTok. Now, there are so many clever people behind the scenes responsible for this research. Thank you to the Edison team back at home for the many, many hours of dedication. Thank you so much. And if you bump into anyone at Odyssey, Cumulus Media, or SiriusXM Media today, please tell them thank you for funding this research that's so useful to this industry. And thank you for being here today. If you're in person, please come and say hello. If you're online, reach out via edisonresearch.com or find us on social media. So now be free. Go share this report with all of your friends, please. Thank you.